Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Examined Life with Phil. Here this week, we're continuing on with our look into the problem of divine foreknowledge, and I have here with me Peter Rasor, who's going to give us the Molinist perspective on divine foreknowledge. Now, he has a BA in mechanical engineering, actually, and then he went on and got an MDiv and an MA from Cincinnati Christian University. Then he got a THM and a THM from Southern Baptist Seminary, as well as a PhD in philosophy from there. He's currently an assistant professor of philosophy at Grand Canyon University, and he runs a podcast and a blog called The Blade. So it sounds like you're a really, really busy guy there, Peter.
Yeah, actually I am, especially when I have 4 children as well, so it keeps me moving.
I can understand that. I've got 2 children myself, so you're doing a whole lot more than I think I could do with even 2 children, so thanks for taking the time to even talk to me. I don't know how you find it.
Oh, well, I like to make the time to discuss things that I find really important, so I thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. So for people who haven't visited your blog or podcast, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, some other things you do besides all your academic work?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I really enjoy doing, as you've already mentioned, is I blog and I podcast. Presently, I've basically suspended those just temporarily till later in this year because I'm working on some writing projects. Actually, I wrote a book that came out in 2017 on the issue of the age of the earth. It's called Controversy of the Ages. I co-wrote that with my PhD advisor, Ted Cable. So if anybody's interested in that particular topic, they can take a look at that book. Again, it's called Controversy of the Ages. I'm also presently working on a couple other type of projects and books. So I do some writing. I also teach at my local church. I'm a co-minister there. I preach every other month. And with that and doing the writing and working, and family, I think that's enough. I am an artist. I just started painting probably about a year and a half ago, maybe a year ago, and had my first art show this past weekend and sold 6 paintings. So, I think that's starting to take off. But that's just a hobby. It's something to sort of get me away from all the other activities that I do.
Cool. Well, that's a lot of yeah, you're even busier than I thought you were. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the other thing I like to do for people who are engaged in philosophy as you are yourself, this was my wife's idea. She said, you need to come up with a question you ask everybody. So the question I ask is, what's a philosophical viewpoint you hold that's odd, that would make other philosophers kind of look at you and go, really? You think that? If you were at a philosophy conference or something like that. If you're willing to admit it. If you're not, I'll give you a pass.
Yeah, no, I'm willing to admit my view of epistemology, even though I'm eclectic and I believe there's more than one way that we know things, in the study of epistemology, I tend to gravitate and give a lot of credence to Scottish common sense realism. That is Thomas Reid and his philosophy of knowledge. And I really enjoyed his epistemology. In fact, I spent a lot of my dissertation in that area. Without going into any details, I spent quite a bit of focus, several chapters on the epistemology of Thomas Reid and the Scottish common sense realist. And I think his approach to epistemology, even though it is not the entire story, I think it's a large part of the story. And if you know anything about philosophy, Reid and common sense philosophy is not popular whatsoever. So I think if I were to tell a philosopher, I like Reid, they'd probably look at me kind of funny. So
I've from the philosophy conferences and stuff I've been to, I think if you take a realistic approach at all in epistemology, you tend to get those kind of looks where they're like, really? How could you think that? So
Right. Yeah. Realism has fallen on hard days in some ways. So
yeah, so this is kind of off topic, but how would the common sense realism of Reid there, I'm not very familiar with that, how would that differ from, say, like an Aristotelian moderate realism? That's kind of the direction I've gone more in.
Well, the thrust of Reid's epistemology is that there are really only 2 avenues I would like to qualify that as a primary avenues by how we come to know things. Obviously, he's in the genre of British empiricism, so he definitely would agree with empiricism. But the thing that he actually contributed that I appreciate is the idea that we come to know most things via testimony. And testimony would include just about anything. It could include TV today for us.
Mm-hmm.
It could include magazines, could include books, internet, etc. Anything that is, if you will, secondhand, and I didn't evaluate empirically one-on-one for myself.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah.
So, for example, how do we come to know our colors? Well, probably our parents pointed at a color and said, that's green or that's red.
Mm-hmm.
How do we come to know our mathematics? Well, a teacher probably said 1 + 1 = 2. Well, I didn't go to a lab or empirically verify that anywhere. Someone told it to me, i.e. a teacher, and that's how we come to know most things. And I think that's right. If we sit down and we think about it hard enough, I think that is how we come to know most things. It's through some avenue of somebody else. We don't verify it. And, this is one aspect that I've asked my students quite a bit. I said, how do you think you know most things? And they'll say, well, we know it through science. I said, well, what is science? When you read your book, in school, your science textbook, you didn't go to the lab and figure that out. You didn't go and perceive that somewhere. What you did is you read in the textbook, i.e. testimony by somebody else who did run the experiment or somebody else who did see it. Same with history, same with everything else. So I think there's really something there that needs to be looked at and I think is correct. So.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and it's actually a good segue into our main topic because we're going to rely on your testimony here to tell us about Molinism.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You're going to have to trust me here, and that I know something about Molinism. So
yeah, exactly. Okay, well, for people who haven't listened to the other episodes I've done on the problem of divine foreknowledge, where I introduced it, and then when I talked to Tim Carter and he gave the Calvinist to the Reform perspective, I'd recommend you do go listen to those as well. But just to dig right in, the problem of divine foreknowledge is, loosely speaking, if God knows what we're going to do in the future, how can we be free? And you can more formally state it like one, necessarily if there's an eternally settled storyline, then Agent A chooses this and not that. 2, necessarily there's an eternally settled storyline. 3, therefore necessarily Agent A chooses this and not that. Or there's a simpler version, A, necessarily if God foreknows X, then X will happen. Necessarily God foreknows X, therefore X will necessarily happen. So would you agree with that formulation of the problem of divine foreknowledge, Peter, or would you state it differently? Or
well, this is how it is typically set up, right? The problem of divine foreknowledge and free will. And I, as a Molinist, I look at this particular argument and I find in the second premise a problem. So the way it's actually formulated, I would disagree with.
Okay.
For example, the second example that you gave, the second premise is necessarily God foreknows X. Well, I don't think that's true. I don't think it's necessary that God foreknows X. In fact, if we take a look at throughout history and even presently, a lot of theologians as well as philosophers, when they ask the question about God's knowledge, specifically foreknowledge, I don't think most would agree that God necessarily foreknows X. The reason why I say that is because basically when you say that, you're saying that God had to create this particular universe, this particular world. It's necessary. So in other words, what you're actually doing by stating that necessarily God foreknows X is you're saying that God doesn't have any free will himself. There's no such thing as divine freedom. And so my point is that actually that God has foreknowledge is necessary, but the content of God's foreknowledge is not necessary. So God could have chosen to create a world in which I don't exist, for example. So therefore, that second premise isn't necessary. It actually would be different.
Okay. So I really, really like coffee. So God foreknows foreknew back at the very beginning of time, whenever that was, that Phil Kahlberg would really, really like coffee. But what you're saying is, if we add necessary, that kind of locks it in stone where it has to be that Phil Kahlberg, whenever he came about, really, really liked coffee, where what you actually want to say is, well, no, we want God to be able to create a world where Phil Kahlberg maybe could like coffee, maybe could not, where God sort of has those options where he can say, Phil likes coffee or Phil doesn't. Is that
Right.
right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And William Craig, in his book, The Only Wise God, which is one of the recommendations that I would give your listeners interested in the Molinist perspective. William Lane Craig's very well known for being a proponent of Molinism, and that book, Only Wise God, is the very popular one. Now, sort of a caveat here, that book is really thin, but it's really thick, if you know what I mean.
I do.
So
very good, but very dense.
Yes, very dense. It's only like 100 pages, but it's very dense. Well, I like there's an example in there that he gives, and I think it's right on target. Just to make sure that I get it correctly, I'm going to turn to the page here to give the example. His point is, I think, very well taken. So here's his example. He gives it on page 72, and it's very similar to the example that you gave here. He says, necessarily, if Jones is a bachelor, Jones is unmarried. Jones is a bachelor, therefore Jones is necessarily unmarried. Now you see that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, because is it necessary that Jones is unmarried? No, it just so happens that he is unmarried. And so there's actually freedom here in which a world could have been created in which Jones happens to be married, not unmarried. And so we want to make sure that that second premise doesn't add, as we would say, that modal attribute of necessary. Because I don't think God's foreknowledge, the content of it, is necessary. It could be otherwise. God could have chosen to create a world in which Phil hates coffee.
Yeah, which seems unthinkable to me, but that's I admit that's a coherent concept. It's possible. I just don't like it. So.
Right.
Okay, so you're drawing a distinction then between God having foreknowledge and the content of that knowledge.
Exactly.
Okay, and that's a distinction that some other viewpoints then deny or don't draw. Is that? Correct?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think your fatalist would definitely, at least the one who has objections to God having foreknowledge and humans having free will, significant free will, or what I would call libertarian free will. And I know we'll probably talk about that a little bit later. But what we call libertarian free will, the ones who say there's a problem there, they're the ones who are going to formulate this and say God necessarily foreknows X. And I think that's a mistake. I don't think that's correct.
Yeah, I can see that, because it seems like that would commit us to, I guess, an ultra-strong deterministic view. Just necessarily God foreknows X. You then have to kind of turn around and say, well, everything that's happened that God could know anything about, which would be everything, is necessary. And that would go everything from the example I gave of me liking coffee to even like the smallest possible chemical and subatomic reactions that are occurring and things along those lines, which seems like a very, very strong and probably, I don't know, I don't even know how you could argue for determinism in that extremely strong of a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. What's interesting is, in a way, the way this argument is formulated is really, in a sense, is kind of begging the question, because they're putting in determinism into the argument. And I don't think that's correct. I think premise 2 is incorrect, because determinism is false. I think we have free will. And if that's the case, then God's foreknowledge is based upon knowing what we would do. So,
well, this is jumping ahead a little bit here, but I know of some people who would want to object to this by then saying, well, what you're doing is you're flipping it around, and that what we want is we want us to be dependent on God, and you're making God's knowledge dependent on us. And so that's jumping ahead to some objections, but I know that that's like what Reformed theologians will say. I know that's what some of my Thomistic friends who are big proponents of Aquinas's philosophy will say. So what's
Right.
your response to that?
Well, I would have two responses, and I think two of them. I think both of these, the responses are different. But I think either one is good enough to defeat that particular objection. One, I would say, well, what's the problem if God's foreknowledge is dependent upon my free actions? How does that make him less sovereign? How does that make him out of control? I don't see how it does. Just by stating it as, oh, well, that means that God's dependent on it. Well, why is that a problem?
Hmm.
Well, usually you'll get, well, because that undercuts God's sovereignty. How does that undercut God's sovereignty? Well, typically what you'll get is because God's not in control. Oh, well, now you're saying because you want determinism to be true in some sense. Well, now we're just arguing in a vicious circle, right? At least in some sense. So I don't see why there's a problem. Now, if you have a problem with God somewhat his knowledge depending upon our free will actions, that was my sort of answer, biting the bullet in responding. Now, let's see if we can actually say, is that the case? Is God really depending upon our knowledge? And in a real sense, I think you could argue that no, he's not even really depending upon us for his knowledge, because the Molinist perspective is that God has always had this knowledge. He's not dependent upon what we humans are going to do in order to know it. He already knows it. He's known it from eternity. I mean, that's the whole point of Molinism and counterfactuals of freedom, or what we call mental knowledge. The whole point is that God has known it forever, for eternity. So whether you just want to bite the bullet and say, okay, yeah, God is dependent, I think there's a response to that. Or I think more accurately, we could respond and say, God, actually, his knowledge isn't dependent on what I'm doing, because he's always known it from eternity. That's the Molinist perspective.
Okay. Well, that's a good segue to talk a little bit more about the Molinist perspective and the ideas of middle knowledge and counterfactuals and how they make sense of this. And you'll probably remember this better, but Molinism is named for Luis Molina. I don't recall who was a Jesuit. I don't recall off the top of my head which century he lived in. Do you remember
1600s.
that? 1600s. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but my study of it has told me that it was kind of revived by Alvin Plantinga, who somewhat independently came up with the idea. And I kind of like to joke it was probably a bad day for him when he found out that Molina had the idea first, because you think you've got this great new idea solving this great problem, and then do some more reading in history and realize, oh, somebody beat me to it a couple hundred years ago.
Yeah. I think you're right. The philosopher who's contemporary to us, who revived it, would be Alvin Plantinga, and then many others have attached themselves to it as well. It's become very popular. Like
William Lane Craig, who you mentioned, who's a very prominent and popular Christian philosopher who stakes his tent on Molinism. So
absolutely.
Okay, and now the way I've understood it is kind of at a more simple, less technical level, and you can you jump in and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's sort of like this, where back when I was in my 20s, every time I went on a road trip, I stopped and got coffee, because we've established already how much I really like coffee. Now, somebody who knew me pretty well, who knew Phil, would then be able to say, well, Phil's on this road trip. When he stops and gets gas, he's going to get coffee. Now, would the fact that they know me so well that they know that's what I'm going to do somehow cause or control or make it necessary that I was going to do that? Well, no, of course not. They just know me so well that they knew that's what I was going to do. And I have to say this was in my 20s, because now that I'm getting older, I can't drink coffee as much anymore. It's really quite horrible. But,
yeah.
So extrapolating up from that, that's kind of simplistic, but then go up to God, who knows me infinitesimally more than any human could. Well, wouldn't it follow from that he could, at least theoretically, know me so well that he's going to know what I'll do in any given situation, not just whether or not I'm going to get coffee on this road trip, but like he would know what I would do if I was the president of the United States, which I sometimes wonder if maybe that's the reason why I'm not the president, is God knows exactly what I would do.
Yeah.
And in every other conceivable situation, he knows what it would be like if I'd had different parents, if I'd married somebody different, if my kids had been different, if I'd gone to a different school, and so on and so on and so on. And then you can use that to kind of extrapolate and say, well, God knows what we're going to do in any given situation.
Right.
So does that more or less in line with where you want to go, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's the essence of what we call middle knowledge. Molinism, I would describe as including middle knowledge along with the other aspects of how God's knowledge is understood. So, middle knowledge is really the unique contribution that Molina gave to us.
Hmm.
And so that's what he's known for. But Molinism also has sort of bookends. We call it middle knowledge because it's sort of in the middle, via media, as we would call it, between two other types of knowledge that God has. So Molina, he talked about a thing called natural knowledge. And I like to sort of envision this as God just by himself before all creation. That's what God has. He has knowledge of all possibilities, what he could do, what he could create, what he couldn't create. There may be an infinite number of possible worlds, right? And then at the other end of the book ends here, and at the other side is what we call free knowledge, and that's what will happen, will occur within the created universe after he has already decided to create the specific one. And then between those two, the bookends, we've got the middle knowledge, and it's exactly as you were describing them. A lot of times the way I like to explain it to make it easy to understand is think of if-then statements. If Peter, that is me, were to find himself on March 15th speaking with Phil, then he would be talking about Molinism. Okay,
Which we know is true at this point.
Yeah, which actually we know is true at this time. But God would know that particular if-then statement from all eternity. And the thing that's really key here that really helps us with foreknowledge and free will and God's sovereignty is that because God knows that, then he is able to also bring about his own plans and weave them, if you will, if I can say it that way, into my own free will decisions and everybody else's free will decisions, because he knows beforehand what it is I would do in any given circumstance.
Okay.
And so that's what God's foreknowledge is based upon, is that middle knowledge.
So, kind of as you were saying before, that's reversing the usual dichotomy where we think of it, where it's not that I'm going to do whatever it is I'm going to do tomorrow because God knows it. It's that God knows it because that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, and this is very important. In fact, this is how I typically, for the average person, the non-experienced philosopher or theologian, this is how I explain it to my students, for example. This is the very first thing I say. Just because somebody knows it or God knows it or I know it doesn't mean that I caused it or that God caused it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the examples I always give is, you gave one perfectly, but let me give one illustration that I like to give, and that is my wife. She loves lasagna. Well, I could easily say, if I take my wife out to an Italian restaurant for our anniversary, then she will choose lasagna. Well, if we go on our anniversary to an Italian restaurant and she chooses lasagna, did I make her choose it?
No.
No, I didn't. There's no causal connection there whatsoever. I just happen to know her so well that if I take her to an Italian restaurant on our anniversary, she's choosing lasagna. Now, how much more so considering God,
Mm-hmm.
he knows us intimately in ways that I could never even imagine knowing myself. Not just because he just knows, but because he's even created us. I mean, he has all knowledge. He's created us. He's aware of everything, omnipresent, and all these other attributes that we talk about in theology. So, I mean, this is now knowing me, if you will, on steroids. I mean, that's how God knows everything. And because of that, he has this foreknowledge, and there's no causal connection. So that's how I always try to explain right out of the barrel. Just because God knows it doesn't mean he caused it. There's
Okay.
no causal connection there, and I don't think logically you can make that connection. I just don't see it whatsoever. Just because you have knowledge of something doesn't mean that you caused it to happen.
You're making me want to jump ahead to the end of my notes here because I say something similar, but I'll resist the. So you would then. So as far as you're concerned, obviously, Molinism is the answer to this. So Could you kind of
I would say
summarize some of the stuff you've said? Give us your best pitch for Molinism then, before we go to the objections.
Oh yeah, sure. The reason why I think Molinism does a fantastic job is because, at least presently, you and I were talking before we started recording. I believe that there's different ways to answer the question of foreknowledge, God's providence, and human free will. I just happen to think that Molinism does the best answer. And until something else comes along that perhaps does even better, then I'm going to stick with Molinism. And that's how I see it. And so I don't think Molinism is a particular paradigm that thus saith the Lord. So I don't think anybody has to accept Molinism whatsoever. In fact, I would imagine most people in the pew, if you will, never even heard of Molinism. They just think, oh yeah, God knows the future, and they go on with life. They don't think about these types of things. But I do think once we start looking at the nitty-gritty here and trying to understand it from a human perspective, I think Molinism does the best. The reason why I say that is because Molinism, in my view, does a great job in God being able to have a plan, being able to have divine freedom, and to create that which he wants to create while still having human beings maintain what we call libertarian free will. He doesn't force us and override our wills. Now, he can, and I think there are particular times that he probably does, and I think we see that in Scripture. There's some points that I think, there were times that he did probably at least influence, override at times people's wills. We even see that with miracles. Obviously, God isn't just letting the physical nature do what it's going to do, all things being equal. I mean, that's what a miracle is. God is intervening directly.
You mean times like where it says in Exodus that God hardened Pharaoh's heart and things like that?
Well, I'm not convinced necessarily that might be a particular example of this, because there's a lot of Molinists who would look at the Pharaoh example of God hardening his heart as being both free will and God. They would see it compatible with Molinism, and that's how they would explain that. And I don't really take a position there, to be quite honest. I think it's possible to explain that whole situation of Pharaoh, his heart being hardened, with the Molinist perspective, because if you look at the text also says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. So you've got both things going on. You got God hardening his heart, you got Pharaoh hardening his heart. And so you can actually explain that and make sense of it based on Molinism. I don't necessarily do that. I think there's probably some other things going on with the text itself that need to be looked at more closely. But getting back to the idea of why I think Molinism does a great job is because all the other views that I've ever looked at have done a poor job. For example, you said you had a friend of yours on dealing with the more the Calvinist perspective or the Reformed perspective. And typically we call that compatibilism when you look at it from a human free will perspective. And compatibilism, to me, just lapses into determinism. I honestly, personally, cannot make sense of it, because if God is ordaining everything and is determining everything, then that's determinism. How do I have free will? Well, the way they explain it is they change the definition of free will, which I have an issue with.
That's exactly what Tim argued for when we were talking about it for the last 2 weeks.
So in a sense, I don't think they're intentionally doing this, but in a sense, you could almost see it as a bait and switch, because they're saying, I believe in free will, but they're redefining it. They're switching the definition out on you. When I say free will, I really mean free will. I, as a person, I can abstain from a particular decision, or I can exercise a particular decision. And we call that agent causation in philosophy, and that's what I'm a proponent of. I honestly believe we have a genuine, truly free will. But if you look at Calvinism or the Reformed perspective or compatibilism, you don't get that. God is still ordaining everything. And to me, when you say ordain, maybe you have some other kind of definition for it, but the only one I've been able to find through my years of study is really what they mean is God's determining everything.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think some type of libertarian free will or agent causation is almost certainly true, just because if you look at how it seems prima facie obvious because we all think about our lives that way. We all proceed as if that is the case. And
Yeah.
I there's a more and less philosophically sophisticated ways to say this, but I kind of have the opinion of if myself and nearly every other human being I know perceives something as if it's true, then I think you need a very strong argument or a very strong defeater to show me that it's not true. Now you can point to examples where that is the case, because like it might appear like the world is flat, but we've got some very good arguments and defeaters as to why no, it's a sphere.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in the case of free will, I've never really heard one. It's sort of like I think if you're going to turn around and claim that we don't have it, that it's more compatibilism or straight determinism, the burden's kind of on you to then explain, well, not only why is it that way, but why do we perceive it being the other way? And to my knowledge, nobody's really done that without kind of assuming it. And if Tim's listening, he'll probably be railing against me for saying that after our discussion last time. But
Well, here's the thing. I mean, I think you're right. When you have a very strong sense or inner experience of this thing called free will, that we actually really do have a choice, that I don't have to make a certain choice, and that I'm not always causally determined to make a particular choice. When we have this inner experience, as I would call it, or inner sensation, and it's so strong, and the overwhelming majority of human beings have this, I think it has something to say for it, you know? I really do. Now, can all human beings be wrong? Of course they can. But I think when we're dealing with this particular thing, if we have a theology or a philosophy that contradicts what I experience every day, and like the majority of human beings experience every day, there's something wrong with your philosophy, in my opinion. And so it needs to be looked at again.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I really liked what you said about treating Molinism more as like a good theory than sort of the answer and that's it. Because I think that's a very good approach both in philosophy and in several aspects of theology, where you're going to say, well, this is my theory that I think makes sense of the data, which is both what Scripture tells us and what philosophy tells us. But, hey, if somebody gives me a better theory, I'm okay with that. I'm willing to go with that.
Absolutely.
Because it's treating it more like a theory, like in the sciences, like in physics, sort of how like Newtonian physics replaced Ptolemaic physics, and now we've replaced Newtonian physics because better theories came along.
So, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so with all the theories that are out there, Reformed Calvinism / compatibilism, that's one of them. Then you've got simple foreknowledge, which is typically seen as traditional Arminianism. And then you got open theism. I mean, you got classical theism. But when I take a look at all of those, and then I compare it with Molinism, I was just deeply unsatisfied with all those other possibilities. And so when I came across Molinism, I was like, well, maybe this is a good way to think of it. And when I dove into it and studied it, like I mentioned before to you before the recording, I spent 3 to 4 years really trying to understand Molinism, because it is somewhat of an in-depth topic and philosophically rigorous, and it takes some thinking, and a lot of reading. And I came to the end of my study, and I was like, okay, yeah, I think this one does do the best explanation of the data, what we have, what we know from Scripture, and what we know from as human experience and stuff. I had problems with classical theism. I had problems with open theism. I had problems with Calvinism. I had problems with our, the traditional Arminianism. So I said, well, then I'm stuck with Molinism, because it seems to me that it still keeps free will intact while also still affirming God's foreknowledge. And
cool.
So that's what I'm going with.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a chance later on to tell me what your problems are with all those other views.
Sure.
But so what I'm hearing you say is you just looked at all the views you could find, and as far as you can tell, Molinism's the theory that works the best, that either has the fewest problems or no problems that you think are big problems, I guess.
They're not insurmountable. That oh no, this can't be true, and so therefore I have to give up one of my other theological beliefs, like foreknowledge or free will or something.
Yeah. One thing that I talked about a long time ago when I did a podcast last year on systems thinking is, I said, when you think about things more in a system sense rather than a linear sense, you're going to realize that every system or theory that human beings come up with is going to at least have the appearance of some problems.
Oh,
Or there's going to
absolutely.
be something that somebody can point to and go, well, you haven't really dealt with this. And that alone shouldn't make you then turn around and say, well, that doesn't work, because you're going to find that everywhere, no matter what position you take, whether it's in philosophy, theology,
Absolutely.
religion, politics, anything. So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I entirely agree with you. I mean, if we think about it as Christians, when I look at Scripture, there are some troubling things in there that I don't quite get and I can't answer. But am I going to give up my faith? Well, no, because I have so much overwhelming other things that outweigh that, And that, okay, yeah, it's a problem I wish I could figure out, but at the end of the day, it doesn't bother me because I know Christ rose from the dead and everything is true and everything's cool. Maybe one day I'll figure this other little point out,
Yeah, that's what I've said to some people who've talked to me about these things. Is I was talking to somebody a while back who said, well, Phil, you seem like a reasonable guy. How do you deal with these problems, like the lack of evidence for the Exodus, according to him, or these writings of Paul and things like that? And then this guy told me, well, I do think Christ was divine. And I was kind of like, well, hooray, because you've just made my job easy. All I had to do was really explain, well, let's say all the problems you're throwing at me are true. None of them show Christ wasn't divine. None of them show that he didn't rise from the dead. If you think that's the case, you should be a Christian. No,
that's right.
Maybe you're not going to fit in so well in some churches because they're going to have problems with some things you're saying. But if you think Christ rose from the dead, then there's nothing stopping you from being a Christian, even if you and I are going to have theological disagreements and things like that. So,
Sure. And, the theologian in me would just respond and say, these other elements are just a part of sanctification, growing in understanding and your knowledge of God and of Christ, etc. And those things can be taken care of later.
Exactly,
but you're right. All you need is Jesus who he said he was, and did he do what he said he did, as recorded in the Scriptures. If you agree with that, then, hey, welcome to the family.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's move on a little bit. There are two main objections I've heard to Molinism, and I'd like you to deal with them. The first one, it can get a bit technical, but it's often called the grounding objection. And this is, well, where does this knowledge that God has of us come from? And the way I understand it is, well, it's kind of easy to see where the knowledge comes from when, say, you're talking about how you know your wife, or I'm talking about how my friends know me. But we're kind of saying God has this knowledge from the very beginning of time, before we were even created. And not only would he have to have that knowledge of me and you, but he'd have to have that knowledge of potential people who don't exist. Like my parents had 4 kids because they kept trying for a girl. Well, say one of my brothers had been a girl instead. It'd be a different person. But God would have to have knowledge of what that girl would be like, what life she would have lived, how she would have behaved, and so on. And you can easily see how the possibilities, if they're not infinite, they really approach infinity.
Kind of reminds me of the Netflix show, The Flash.
Oh, I haven't watched that one yet.
Well, he creates a parallel line in time, and exactly what you say happened. He goes back in time, and he's able to come back. Instead of one of his friends having a daughter, he now has a son. So,
Oh, is that based off the Flashpoint Paradox comics?
Yeah, Flashpoint. Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm a little familiar with that. I just haven't watched that particular show on Netflix yet. My wife and I do like the superhero shows. We just haven't got to that one yet. So
yeah, well, I think that's in season 4. But anyway, for your listeners, I think that might be a good touch point to sort of keep in their mind here to illustrate what you're talking about. So that's why I bring it up.
Oh, no, that's great. I like references to good media and shows because I enjoy watching them myself. So. Okay, so then the objection is, well, where does this knowledge come from? How can God have knowledge of someone who doesn't even exist?
Right.
Well, that's all I was going to say about that. Yeah.
Yeah. This is the main objection to Molinism from a philosophical standpoint. Theologians, I guess, probably voice this as well. But as a Christian theologian, I don't think it's really going to be that much of an issue because really that's how I approach it. Philosophically, can I give an explanation where this knowledge is coming from? No, but what I can say is that that's what it means to be God. He just has all knowledge. He has all counterfactuals of freedom is what we call them, or mental knowledge, the if-then statements. He has that, as well as all possibilities, as well as what will happen. That's just what it means to be God. He has all this knowledge. Exactly where did it come from? I mean, I can't explain that. I mean, it would almost be like me trying to explain how is it that God's omnipresent. I don't know. How is it that God is omnipotent? I have no idea. How is it that God exists as Trinity? I don't know, but He is. How is it that Jesus became incarnate and has these two natures as being fully divine and fully human? I don't know what that looks like. It just is. So at the end of the day, even though this is probably the biggest objection, and I understand the objection, as a Molinist, I'm not clouded or blinded here when it comes to that, but it's like what we were saying. To me, it doesn't bother me. To me, I'm just like, well, that's just what it means to be God. He just knows everything. How do I ground it? I don't feel like I need to. That God just knows it. He's the greatest possible being to exist, and so he has the greatest possible knowledge, and that's would include mental knowledge. So that's what I go with. So it never really has bothered me. Some philosophers, theologians, it really bothers, but this objection. But like I said, I just see it as being part and parcel of what it means to be God.
So, if I'm understanding you, it's not quite like you're then turning around and appealing to mystery or saying that's something we can't know. You're doing something a little different there.
Yeah, it's nuanced, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, you're being much more nuanced than that. Yeah. So it's more like you're saying that's just kind of baked into the definition of what it means to be God. Yeah. And we can't really truly explain everything about what it means to be God because, well, we're not God.
Yeah, it'd be the finite grasping the infinite, which is not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or I guess
it's the same thing when people say, you give the Kalam cosmological argument or some other argument for God's existence, and then someone retorts back, well, then who created God? Well, that from a theological, philosophical, Christian standpoint, that question is nonsensical because that's what it means to be God. He necessarily exists.
He's the uncreated creator. He's the unmoved mover.
Exactly. Yeah. So he has what we call aseity. He exists in and of himself. He just exists. So to ask that question is, from a theological, Christian philosophical perspective, is really nonsense. And so I kind of see the grounding objection somewhat similar. That's just what it means to be God.
Okay.
He exists. Yeah. He has all knowledge,
One of my previous guests on the podcast, a guy who runs the Inspiring Philosophy YouTube channel, he has a video up called The Worst Objection to Theism Ever, Who Created God?
Yeah.
Okay.
And when you look throughout church history, I mean, that's how theologians and philosophers have always, described God. He's always existed. He has all knowledge. Can we explain how he has it? Well, this is what it means to be God.
Okay, interesting. All right, and now there's the other objection. And I told you when we were talking before we started recording that for a number of years I kind of went with the Molinist perspective, and this is the one that made me kind of take a step back and think, well, maybe this isn't right. Mm-hmm. And this is the idea that, well, all this really does is push the determinism back a step or two, because if God knows what I'm going to do in any given situation, then he can arrange the world such that I'm going to do what he wants me to do. And the example I like of this is, well, God wanted Paul to write the text of Romans. Now, God knows what Paul would have wrote if he'd been in, say, Alexandria or Thessaloniki instead. So God arranged the world so Paul would be in Romans, so we got the book of Romans. Mm-hmm. Now, in a certain sense, you can then say, well, that's still kind of deterministic, because although we're saying Paul freely wrote Romans, he was doing what God arranged it for him to do anyway. And I heard some people give that objection one time at some philosophy conference I was at, and that's the one that made me go, well, maybe this viewpoint doesn't work quite as well as I thought it did. So what do you say to that one?
Yeah, this is actually the biggest hang-up for me when I first started looking at Molinism, for not accepting it. I originally did not accept Molinism because I thought it was determinism. And the reason why I thought it was determinism was because my Div advisor, my thesis faculty member, Jack Cottrell, by the way, if anybody's interested, he has a lot of books out. And I think you can actually find one of his papers called God and Time, which deals with some of these aspects online. If you type it in, you can probably find it. But he's the one that taught in one of his classes on the doctrine of God that Molinism is also determinism, because just as you said, God basically orchestrates the circumstances that he knows that what you will choose freely. How is this not determinism? And so I initially rejected determinism because that seemed to make sense to me by what Dr. Cottrell was saying and taught in his classes. But then as I listened to people like William Lane Craig and others describe Molinism, they're all saying, no, this is libertarian free will. This is not determinism. This is libertarian free will, you know. So I was like, so I must be missing something. Because if they're all saying it maintains libertarian free will, but yet my advisor is saying, no, it's determinism, and I thought it was determinism, then maybe I'm missing something. And so this was the one main reason that I went into 3 or 4 years studying Molinism. Because I was unsatisfied with all the other views. And so that was the one main point I had to figure out. I just had to figure out because I was convinced that libertarian free will is true, and I still am. So I said, if Molinism is true, then I got to make sure it's not determinism, right?
Okay, yeah.
Make sense of all the data, right? So as I investigated it, let me cut to the chase here. Let me give you 2 responses to that objection. Actually, let me give you several. There's another one I just came up with. Let's just bite the bullet for a minute, okay? Let's bite the bullet. This is how I like to approach these kinds of things. You know, I did this earlier, or responding to some of the other things. Let's bite the bullet for a minute. Let's just say, okay, God determines all the circumstances and creates and orchestrates everything in the universe. So take this almost to an extreme determinism, let's say. But let's just have the world in a sense where humans have a libertarian free will, okay? But we have God orchestrating everything else except the choices of these people, okay? So let's say that's the case. Now the question is, does libertarian free will get destroyed in such a scenario? Well, let's think about it. I came up with this illustration. Go back to my wife, okay? She likes lasagna. I want to, let's say, have a surprise birthday party for her. But I know in order to have a surprise birthday party for her at my house, I have to get her out of the house that evening.
Okay.
So I'm going to say, you know what? I'm going to take my wife out for her birthday because that's going to get her out of the house. And I know that if I ask her, hey, you want to go to dinner on your birthday? That she'll go out for her birthday with me and get her out of the house. Okay? Now, am I orchestrating the events to get her out of the house? Well, of course I am. But if she chooses freely to leave the house and go to dinner with me that night, did I force her to choose that? No, I didn't. It all goes back to that causal link again that we talked about earlier. Just because you know something doesn't mean it causes it. So my wife, even though I orchestrated all the events that night to have a surprise birthday party for her and get her out of the house so, you know, let's say my parents and everybody else and her friends can come over and decorate the house, she still freely chose when I asked her to go to dinner with me. She said, yes, I will go to dinner with you. But I'm orchestrating the events, right? Because I need to get her out of the house so I can have the surprise birthday party plan. So at the end of the day, even if God orchestrates everything, do human beings still maintain freedom? Of course they do.
I see.
Just as
really
the same
counterexample.
Yeah, just as the same way as even though I orchestrated my events for my wife to get her out of the house, she still freely chose to leave the house and go to dinner with me. Her will was still intact. She still freely chose. Now,
so in a sense, in your example there, we can say, in a certain sense, you determined, if we're using the word a little loosely, you determined getting your wife out of the house so you could have the surprise party, but at the same time, your wife still
freely chose to leave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm using that word loosely because that's clearly not the philosophical definition of determinism in that sense, but it's kind of pushing in that direction at the same time.
Well, yeah, it's a middle way. I mean, right between a Calvinism and let's say, a really loose kind of free will, right? So, but here's the thing. I've done a lot of thinking since then. So if you just bite the bullet and you take it to almost its most extreme that you can in Molinism, I still don't see how free will is destroyed. It's still there. It's still there. Okay. But here's my view. I was just explaining this to a theology friend of mine just this past week. Molinism is actually very malleable. You can take it to almost the extreme that I just said, where you're almost having God determine all the circumstances in the universe, determining a lot of stuff, but you still somehow keep intact free will. Or you can take it way toward the other end of the spectrum. And this is what I mean by that. God, and I think this is more of the realistic approach here, and this is the approach I take within Molinism. God does not determine all the circumstances in the universe. Because if you think about it, we as agents, if we believe in libertarian free will, we are causing events. We are causing things to happen in circumstances. Our own free choices are causing circumstances to arise. So what God does is he is able to orchestrate not only his own plans and determine some things based upon his mental knowledge, knowing that if we are in X situation, we would choose to do Y, let's say. But he also is, think of it as like we're co-creators of reality. Because my choices as Peter, your choices as Phil are creating events, right? I mean, you created an event tonight with me. We're creating an event now. We're making a podcast, you know, which is going to create another event, which is going to be posting it on the website, and then which is going to create other multiple events, right? It's like a flowering tree, right? Branching tree, if you will. I think it's the same way with God. It's just much more strong because God has actual plans and providential things that he wants to accomplish, but he's able to weave them into our own free will decisions, which create events, and so he can put them all together. Now, to me, if you remember that book, Your God is Too Small, the title of it?
I don't think I'm familiar with that book.
It's like back in the 70s, I think.
Okay.
There's a book entitled Your God is Too Small.
Do you remember who wrote it?
I don't remember who wrote it. I just remember the title because I love the title. Because it illustrates well. Because if you start thinking of Molinism in this sense, wow, God is huge. How in the world, I mean, think of the mind, the knowledge that you would have to have in order to allow human beings to have this libertarian free will to arise and bring into existence circumstances, along with God also using those circumstances that he knows we're going to create, as well as bringing and making his own circumstances arise. I mean, this is huge. I mean, this is even better than a computer or AI, right? Artificial intelligence. I mean, this is huge.
Yeah, that reminds me actually of another tie into a Netflix show. Are you familiar with the sci-fi show Travelers that's on Netflix?
I've heard of it, but I have not seen it. No.
Well, part of the premise is people are coming back from the future to change the future because the future is terrible. There's been apocalyptic events and humankind is on the edge of extinction. And I'm giving away a slight spoiler because there's a entity called the director that gives them all their orders, that tells them, you do this mission, you're supposed to make sure this person lives through this accident, and so on and so forth. It's
so they're writing basically the future. They're trying to rewrite the future. Okay.
They're trying to rewrite the future, and someone called the director in the future is sending them the messages saying, do this, do this, do this. Here's how you're supposed to do it. Well, you find out at a certain point that the director is not a human being. It's an incredibly advanced AI. And when my wife and I were watching that, we're like, oh, well, that makes sense. No human being could ever possibly keep track of the infinitesimal possibilities that would arise from something like this. The only thing that could even come close would be something like a very advanced AI or
Or God.
Obviously God, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's actually kind of funny because as I was watching that show, I remember thinking of many options where they're like trying to figure out, well, what if the director's wrong? No, maybe he foresaw this. And I'm looking at that thinking, people have those conversations about God all the time. Well, why is God allowing this? Oh, well, he must have his reasons. And they're literally having that conversation about an advanced AI in the future that's trying to make everything better. So
Yeah, and see, Molinism makes sense of all that. You bring out the practical question of why did God allow this to happen or allow that to happen? Why evil atrocities? Well, because I think he knows what people are going to freely choose later, and he knows the events that are going to outcome later. And so in order for them to transpire the way he wants them to transpire and what's best for us, well, sometimes terrible, evil things have got to happen because that's what people have chosen,
Okay, so that's where I'm splitting up Peter and I's discussion. You'll get to hear the second part of it next week. I'll lob some more objections to Molinism at Peter to see how he responds, and I'll also get his reactions to the other answers to the problem of divine foreknowledge. We'll get to hear what he thinks about open theism, Reformed or Calvinistic theology, divine timelessness, simple foreknowledge, and so on. So thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the discussion Peter and I had. I know we both enjoyed it a great deal. And as always, write in and let me know what you think. What do you think about Molinism? Do you think it works? Do you think it's superior to some other views, lower than other views? Just let me know. You can reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, and you can always contact me through the Facebook group for the podcast called The Examined Life with Phil. Just type that in, you'll be able to see it. And as always, if you like the podcast, please share it on your social media so more people can hear about it. And the podcast is also now up on Apple iTunes, so if you're listening off there, please give us a rating and a review, because apparently that helps the algorithms get the podcast out to more people. So thanks again for listening, and you'll be able to hear part 2 of Peter and I's discussion on Molinism next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.